Security analyst Yaakov Lapin and a former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press, Dan Perry, are joining us here in the studio. Thank you both very much for joining us, gentlemen. We have collected bullet points for you to make sense out of them, Mr. Dan Perry.
The critical difference between now and before the ceasefire is that the U.S. is run by Donald Trump and not Joe Biden, and therefore there are effectively no constraints, no guardrails on what Israel can do. Israel can assume that provision of weaponry will continue almost no matter what occurs on the ground. Israel can assume that the most ambitious plans for Gaza would be entertained, things that would have been vetoed essentially by Biden. So that gives Israel tremendously wide berth as to what it might do. And the way things are looking right now, because Yaakov is so right, that it is likely that the paradigm will change and the areas they will take, they will keep. And because the government continues to entertain no option to Hamas in Gaza, PA or whatever else, the implication is that what we're looking at, if this operation is successful, is a prolonged Israeli military and civilian administration of Gaza. But that's what appears to be the end game here.
Not dismissing the importance of discussing the end game here, and yet, if we're just looking at the past 2 weeks, we essentially had a ceasefire intact, and yet zero release of hostages, zero movement or positive dynamics, let's call it that way, in the around the negotiating table. But on the contrary, so something had to give, something had to be done in order to break this deadlock.
Like, also something has to be said, which is that even though ending the war with Hamas remaining in power is in itself a horrible outcome, not just for Israel, but for the region, the world, and for the Palestinians, it is nonetheless the implied outcome of the deal, as I read it, that Israel signed under duress, under pressure by Trump in January. Israel is walking away from the deal it signed because the government was never comfortable with it, and because the very person who
being
forced
honest,
them to sign is now allowing them to walk away.
Trump administration itself said it was not feeling comfortable with the Biden outline. They just said, we need to move forward, so sign this and we'll talk about it later.
And look, in the old polite world, if you sign a deal, under whatever circumstances you're expected to keep it.
Deals are meant to be broken, some will suggest.
Is a world where a negotiated deal is just the beginning point of the next negotiation.
But militarily speaking, what could be the next phase of this current campaign?
I think we're going to see more and more, first of all, Gazan civilians being pushed back to Al-Mawasi, to that humanitarian area as time goes by. Now we're seeing Gaza split again between north and south. And it looks like the more time goes by, the more the Israeli-controlled part of Gaza will grow. And as that happens, I expect Israel to try and push more and more of the civilians to the Al-Mawasi area. It obviously has to tailor these operations, both aerial and ground operations, in a way that takes into account the location of every single one of the 24 living hostages, which we can assume are very much marked out and flagged on every operational map that the Israeli Air Force or the ground forces or the Navy are using. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But I think that this is a phased plan that is only going to increase unless or until Hamas decides to change the terms of its demands going forward.
Ever since he got out of hell in order to bring back his brothers who are still there in captivity, he arrived today at the place where they just, they didn't want to listen, they didn't want to hear, they didn't want to see the UN. So today, he arrived there, so they must see, they must listen to him.
I know that you discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government. Feeding terrorists who tortured me and murdered my family. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it.
No, there are truly no words to describe the spirit and the impact and the power of this man. And what he says, it echoes, it resonates, and it should be heard right there at the UN Security Council.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I hear some people speaking, I think naively, about whether this will convince the ambassadors. It's not about the ambassadors, who are just representatives of governments, but rather about public opinion around the world. I have felt throughout that Israel has had, despite everything, the moral high ground, given what happened on October 7th, and the inadmissibility of maintaining the status quo ante, but hasn't done much with public diplomacy. This is public diplomacy. The man is sympathetic, clearly not a professional propagandist, had endured the most vile treatment conceivable, and is a credible narrator, basically.
But you know what, I would
and
like
also,
to,
the fact that he's a former hostage, I hate to put it in such crass terms, makes him right now a global celebrity.
Yeah.
So to bring him out there, to have him speak, and the way he speaks, and the sympathetic nature of his delivery, I think is effective.
Gentlemen, there's much talk on the legal element here and the element or the layer of legitimacy. It all comes down to trust or lack thereof at the end of the day.
Yeah. No Shin Bet chief has ever been fired in Israel. This would be unprecedented.
Well, no October 7th ever happened in Israel.
Indeed. Look, it must be said, the Shin Bet failed spectacularly on October 7th. But on the other hand, in their own internal inquiry that was published and leaked in recent weeks and months, they sort of admit to that, but also claim that there are warnings that the schism in Israel caused by the current government with its judicial overhaul was going to lead to an attack, and that was ignored.
But this all goes back to the finger-pointing discourse. And there is a basic question we can discuss, and we will be discussing the how, but the what. The fact that the head of the Shin Bet needs to conclude his term.
This is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
He has said he would go, and the government can fire him, absolutely. But there's a procedure in Israel for how to fire the head of the Shin Bet. And that procedure involves some sort of a review of the reasons for it, and for going through the steps that are necessary. And one reason for firing Shin Bet cannot be that he no longer is liked or trusted by the Prime Minister. He is not a personal appointment of the Prime Minister. So there's an inelegance about this that creates what the Attorney General called the suspicion of illegality, conflict of interest, because we must not forget that the man who's about to be fired probably tonight is also leading the agency that is investigating the Prime Minister's office.
And yet the Supreme Court is telling the Attorney General, you have nothing to do with approving or disapproving this.
Well, and moreover, the Attorney General that's trying to block this is herself en route to being fired.
Yeah.
So this is a blowing up of the entire Israeli
culmination of
internal gatekeepers system that is in place for a reason. Because in Israel's brittle democracy, there's a need for these gatekeepers to prevent the country from sliding into authoritarianism, and to do this during the escalation of a major military conflict is problematic.
One side saying, yay, democracy. One side saying, end of democracy. There's no middle here.
Look, the breakdown of trust here between the Shin Bet and the government is obviously bad for Israel, bad for security, bad for society. There have to be better ways to manage fundamental disagreements between the political echelon and the head of the Domestic Intelligence Agency. Now, it's important to point out, one of the things that really saddens me is that when we talk about the Shin Bet, and it has become a conversation that's political.
Right, the Shin Bet is a shadow organization.
I think this is tragic. Let's remember, the Shin Bet is the organization that saves so many lives every month, prevents so many terror attacks. This is what it's there to do. This is what it does day in and day out. So,
and in a clandestine fashion, not such a public manner.
And we don't hear about these successes, but that's what enables us to actually live here, basically, it's the Shin Bet. So,
and on that note, gentlemen.
It is okay for them to disagree. It has to be done in a way that is not
the what
toxic.
is one thing, the how completely different story.